Thank you for an amazing presentation. One of the things that I suppose the students have been asking since you've just left the main auditorium is, how do you get from being somebody who's intensely interested in the nature of the creation of spaces and forms and what they might represent beyond just a construct, how do you move from that to being as incredibly successful as an architect of the commercial, but the commercial that's thinking, that's giving something else? How do you do that? So it's like your history.
Yeah, I think the idea of architecture as a cultural medium, and maybe the most experimental one, is partly what kind of drives all this. Some days I might walk into the office and say, I love film, I'd love to be a filmmaker, I'd love the pure free fall of graphic design where you're dealing with weightlessness and so forth, and pure emotion. But I love, in fact, the architecture that has, confrontation with the body, and that's what its medium is, and it's different than sculpture and so forth. So essentially, part of the reason why I decided to be an architect when I was a little kid is I said, architects do big things. They have grand ideas and they transform space. And so that sense of scale and possibly permanence, although I don't think I understood permanence in the way in which if I were to grown up in London, what that meant. But so in other words, it's a toolkit of things to play with that even a filmmaker doesn't have, because we've got statics and gravity and reflection and materiality in real time.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's got the greatest amount of possibilities for expression.
So then, how do you move from a kind of an academic career to then transform into somebody who's making a difference with all of that kind of thinking? Because I think for a lot of students, they can't see the link between the academic world and the world of architecture as they see represented around them. How did you do that?
Well, maybe
so few did, so few have.
Yes, I think that I can allude, to the opening kind of gambit of the talk about taking the wedge out between, school and sort of the public career, of an architect in a way. And I could say, thank God somebody finally hired me to do something. Somebody, put some money down and said, I not only do I somehow trust you, but I believe that your ideas can translate. And I think it was just wish fulfillment, all those years of working and drawing. Because I didn't spend time doing anything else, for 15 years. I didn't make movies. I mean, I played music. That was my one outlet. But I worked on architecture. I didn't draw furniture or design cars or paint. So super dedicated, to the medium. And I don't think I could get to where I am now without that, totally sustained connection. I couldn't probably drop it for a while and then paint, or drop it for a while and be a photographer. So, of course, I studied photographers and filmmakers, but always went into the medium of architecture. Call it what I always say is I was condemned to be an architect. I had no choice. And that just keeps everything moving with a certain kind of inertia. And then there's a, usual kinds of thing, a little luck here, a moment there, somebody becomes interested. And
so does it start with with one small project? Is that kind of, and then you kind of, what do you do that makes it into another and another? How does that work? How did it work for you?
They started, with installation projects at the beginning of the 90s that I did in Japan. Had a little bit of money free to explore some things. And that time I was exploring kind of issues of media and communication in installation work, because I was there, and that was a very impressive world to me. Then it led, a number of years later into bigger installations. And then, the first kind of real good project we did was a 110 square meter shop, eyeglasses shop, with clients who really wanted to engage with me and my office as designers. They're designers, not business people at the first level. So we shared that kind of love. It was great. And I also didn't care that I didn't have somebody's got to be the paradoxical, there is a beginning or
Yes.
not a beginning. And for me, everybody begins at some point. And it was small but intense.
So then, after this time, you could begin to build what I think kind of sort of a series of projects which we call iconic. Well, actually, what we really mean is projects with meaning. So they're teaching projects in many ways, and as a kind of a route to go down. You didn't really make your life easy. You know, it wouldn't, this. I mean, this isn't stuff which simply arrives as a sketch. It's actually the crafting of it, the materiality of it, the consideration of it.
Yes.
I mean, you could have chosen a slightly easier route to kind of, suddenly make the big bucks.
Right.
But you still, you stuck with this, I suppose, this essential wish to describe, to consider, to give. Even for a commercial, it has to give back to public space.
Yes.
And that must have been quite difficult against commercial pressures.
Yeah, I mean, I think that fortunately, being a professor for basically my whole career as well, and just having a culture where teaching students about how to think, which I always say is, if I'm going to do anything, that's it. You'll learn techniques, but we're going to teach you how to do the things that I was doing tonight. Have the nerve to fabricate an argument, whether it comes out of poetics, whether it comes out of rigorous logic, to teach them that there are avenues to be able to create intensity to the work that can touch people in a lot of ways. Sometimes it can touch them in the gut, sometimes it touches them in the head, and I think that the work that I've done is just an extension of teaching students how to do it, because you're a professor too, and it's not surprising to say that teachers want to learn more than their students. That's why we do it.
Indeed.
We are eternal in that quest for thinking and learning in a way, and building is just a very intense medium to kind of play that out. Of course, I've got risk management all around, for sure, but I've managed to figure out how to navigate that so that it seems to be less of a pressure and less visible. I mean, it's just really how we work in the office and the kinds of projects that we have.
Now I've got to ask you the really trite question.
Yes.
And the trite question is, does the kind of work you do you think that's actually giving you kind of a niche that makes you really very much in demand, as compared to, I suppose, what we consider to be a mainstream commercial practice?
Mm-hmm.
Because the question is, I couch the question in a way to sort of see whether is there a degree of pigeonholing, and also, is that something that kind of gives you an edge out there?
It's definitely a kind of paradoxical question, isn't it? Does it open up or close down?
And how do you feel about it? I mean, do you like it like this, or are you thinking, give me $2 billion and I'll do it? It's a reasonable question.
It's a reasonable question, and I think that if one were to really look closely at literally what I began with and where the work is now, it's got an imprimatur authorship to it, and I recognize that. But I also think that the work is moving. Mm-hmm. It's moving around, and it's trying to move and progress. So even if there's a sense of identity, I also don't feel like I'm ever being asked to produce an autograph, and that each project, and I create this relationship with the client. You can't really expect something specific. You can expect something great. You can expect something that has a tremendous amount of authenticity to it. But we need to have a certain amount of freedom to create a constellation of things, either that we're continuing to research or that something may fall into our lap in terms of what we want to work on. I mean, if I'm like everybody. I live in the world and absorb so much. We all have influences and so forth. I mean, I don't think that we just are mimetic and give the world back everything that it already sees and has. I think there is some singular qualities to it, but I don't feel like we or me, I don't feel imprisoned in any way. So I don't know that it's either the lever to launch from all the time, or if it's also something that limits. I would presume that it does both. You know, to be quite honest.
And the paradox is something. The question is whether you can, whether you sustain it, or out of that, do you get a sense of a direction that you'd like to continue to go in? And you know, projects have kind of the real variation in size. They both have the same love. I think one of the things people said, he seems really kind. I think it's about the way in which you just dealt with those students who came to ask you some questions. And that kindness is incredibly powerful. But beyond that, is there a direction that you feel you'd like to have your work go in?
I can't say. I mean, you know, when I was younger, I thought the idea was to, you know, create a project and, you know, you perfect it, you know, your whole life if you think something can contribute. But I also am restless, just like everybody else, and I feel like culture will either tell you something's exhausted, or you'll tell yourself something's exhausted. Maybe it's not, but you find a way to hybridize ideas and so forth. I think just as long as the work is moving, and I know better than anybody, you know, in a way, because I'm my own critic too. If the work is moving, and moving means continuing to try to add to the conversation, not just doing something different for its own sake, or having a crisis, and if you don't have a new idea, then you just take something of someone else to sort of appropriate it. I mean, I'm much more deliberate, you know, than that. But I also feel like this idea of just pushing and being relentless, and I like the idea of being prolific, and I mean that not in an egotistical way, but the more you make, the more you work through, the more you see. And now in my mid-50s, it also feels like, you know, time moves always a little bit quicker, and you want to keep working, you know. It's the architect's dream, right? We just keep going.
But for you, your career is flowering now. I mean, for a lot of people, they want to keep going, but they just want to keep control. Yours is really burgeoning. It's international.
Yes.
And the other interesting thing, I think, for students is to see an academic who makes it happen. That's kind of inspiring for them, because they begin to believe in the process that by teaching you can learn, and there is that kind of reciprocal activity, which otherwise they don't get.
Yes.
The question, though, that they want to know is, what advice would he give me about anything? Because he's done it. In fact, some academics would ask that question. I should be asking you that question myself.
Yes.
Well, what advice do you give a young person involved in this interest in making of environments?
Well, I think, you know, I'm asked the question, you know, how did what happened between, you know, the time of graduating and a certain amount of time, the first 10 years, you know, what happens? And you know, the answer is there certainly are pathways and there's sort of models, but I don't know if they're blueprints of then that sort of work now. I mean, for instance, if you take somebody like Big, that Bjarke is 35 and, you know, lives and works in Northern Europe, but has a different way of going about designing. It's almost like procuring projects is designing.
Yes.
For him and them, and, you know, not to diminish what they do, and whereas, you know, for me, maybe it's a sort of older school project on the one hand, which is I had to worry about what my product was, so to speak, before I could think about was it going to be useful or relevant to anybody. So a kind of slower, more introspective thing, but on the other hand, I'm also restless and feel like, you know, time is something that you just want to create more of so that you can, you know, push as well. We all are ambitious, you know, we just have different ways to go about it. In terms of what I would say to a student, though, I do think that it gets down to the core of your personality and who you are as a person, whether you're kind or restless, or those two things go together. You need to find the ecology that supports who you are, right?
Yes.
And that's really what it is. And I think it's a lot more looking around at that level, whether you're a collaborator or a leader, whether you're somebody who's an idea person or somebody who's an executor, somebody who's technically minded versus conceptually minded. No one is everything. And certainly I'm not, and you have to create a team to do that. So I think it's really getting in touch with who you are to be sort of California about it.
But it's funny you should say that, because I shouldn't quote him, but a prominent architect who's here said, he's so grounded. He's so grounded. It's like talking to a real person, as opposed to talking to star architects who there's a different thing about you and about your practice. So, what's it like being a star?
Well, I mean, I think that being known for being sort of an architect's architect, which I know, and people have told me that, it's a good feeling. I can't deny it. I mean, you don't set out to win friends and approval and all of that. You do your work, and I also feel like as a teacher, and as an architect, I try to provoke and try to yes, I try to inspire, but I'm not a motivational speaker. You could walk out of a lecture and go, "That was bollocks," and
no, I don't think so.
Well,
not after today.
Okay, well, then I took the moment to be persuasive then, and my persuasiveness, worked, and it was all frank and honest, and I think that I do purvey in a kind of genuine frankness that might be a little bit different than what you would, get in the contemporary world, where somebody's image or impression was going to come before, their work in a way. We'll see what happens. I'm happy with the way things are going, and yet there's always the usual genuine sense of disappointment and what happens next, and fear and doubt and so forth. But those are motivators.